There we are. So good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to all, including to our partners from the Centre for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship at the University of Bristol. It is our pleasure to have Dr. Nada Afiouni with us today. Nada is a senior lecturer at the Université of Le Havre, Normandie, and she's a member of the research group on identities and cultures at Le Havre, known as GRIC. And she's a fellow at the ICM, the Institut Convergence Migration, and obviously a founding member of the MIDIB network. Her research focuses on comparisons between France and the UK, more particularly on public policies for managing cultural and religious plurality, citizenship, discrimination, and national identities in the UK and France. Over the past 12 years or so, Nada has come to focus more specifically on the death of Muslim immigrants in Britain and France. And the title of the presentation today is Local Dynamics Between Muslim Actors and Municipal Authorities During the Covid-19 Pandemic in the Municipal Cemeteries of Le Havre and Southampton. So the screen is yours, Nada.
Well, thank you very much, Romain and Vincent, for having me. And thank you for the virtually present. And right now, I should tell you, I'm in Lebanon dealing with some family stuff. So I've got a solid internet connection and finger crossed for the power to stay on. So I'm going to keep a positive vibe, and I'm going to start talking about death and about the pandemic. So why talk about death? Why talk about the placing of the dead? Because the dead continue to have a social and political life after biological death. As Eckert puts it, I've translated the sentence, human remains are caught up in the webs of the social relations of the living. They remain as close as possible to what the latter says about them and do with them. So this social and political life of the dead takes place within the rules put in place by the society in which they died and by the established regulation to dispose of human remains. In the case of religious minorities, public policies for managing cultural and religious plurality also come into play and provide a framework for ensuring the treatment of human remains complies with the broader national, philosophical, and legal framework of plurality management. From this perspective, the way countries distinguish between public and private spaces becomes central to the question of the placing of the dead in public cemeteries. Municipal cemeteries are public spaces, subject to specific national legislation in France and in Britain. In both countries, cemeteries embody national policies for managing diversity in urban spaces. French secularism, la laïcité, strictly distinguishes between public and private. Cultural and religious specificities are confined to the strictly private sphere in the name of integration and Republican secularism. The public sphere is thus constructed as a neutral, universalist zone where minority cultural and religious expressions are banned. So I'm going to go quickly. I decided to go quickly, of course, on these matter, but it was important to remind these pieces. In the United Kingdom, the multicultural management of pluralism has been in place since the 1990s, presupposes permeability, a flow between private and public space, thus allows the expression of religious specificities within public places. Restrictive measures on movement introduced as part of the COVID-19 pandemic response suspended cross-border travel and effectively immobilized populations. For immigrant communities in Europe, border closures affected not only the movement of the living, but also that of the deceased. And this called into question the common practice of post-mortem repatriation. So these stopped, or because of the pandemic, repatriation was no longer possible. This increased the visibility of pandemic-related and introduced various practical, political, and symbolic challenges to minority death burial in local public cemeteries. The closure of borders forced Muslim immigrant communities to turn to local authorities to arrange the burial of their dead. Previous to the pandemic, post-mortem care had solid transnational elements with a high repatriation rate to the deceased country of origin. However, the pandemic significantly disrupted these established practices, limiting the management of deceased body to regional, even local boundaries. Thus, the local level became crucial for organizing funerals for immigrant communities almost overnight. That's why my talk today is centered around the local perspective. I'm going to examine how the Muslim burial sections in the cities of Le Havre and Southampton were managed during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, trying to investigate whether the change of players on the local scene triggered new dynamics that were impossible before the pandemic. My primary concern is the analysis of the negotiations that between religious minorities and public authorities confronted by the pandemic and it voiced the needs of the Muslim communities and expressed concerns. Were they formulated individually or collectively? Do we observe the same patterns in Le Havre and Southampton? What rights and funeral arrangements were afforded to Muslims in France and the UK during the pandemic? I also want to explore the interaction between Muslim communities and local authorities within the framework of broader national, cultural, and religious diversity policies in order to inform the political meaning of dying as a migrant and as a member of a religious minority group during the pandemic. Was there room for diversity and otherness in French and British cemeteries? Were the adjustment to funeral regulation requested in the name of Islam seen as legitimate in these two countries? What I also want to investigate is the various individual and groups who articulate demand, examining their composition and background, and provide an assessment of how these demands were met. I'm aware that it sounds a bit too ambitious, but I'll do my best, as I told you at the beginning, then within those 45 minutes. So why Le Havre and Southampton, in fact? Because the cities of Le Havre and Southampton were the subject of one of my previous research in 2012. So yes, it was like 15 years ago. In 2012, I investigated the municipal cemeteries in both cities and analyzed their management of Muslim burial sites. I think it was published even, Romain, in Troutledge as a chapter of a book. It was in 2012. It was like pretty interesting to review these sites 10 years later and assess the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the funeral rights of Muslim minorities there. During the interviews I've conducted, the participants were invited to share their thoughts on the COVID-19 period, each from a professional viewpoint, focusing mainly on their relationship with local authorities and the necessity of providing Muslim burial plots in times of crisis. I evaluated the nature of the dialogue between Muslim representatives and the local authorities. I analyzed the French and British Muslim demands and assessed potential resentment during and after the crisis. In Le Havre, I've conducted individual interviews and led discussion groups with the various stakeholders. In Southampton, while only individual interviews were conducted, a WhatsApp discussion group, and it's really new for me, a WhatsApp discussion group was created to extend the conversation less formally. This group facilitated ongoing discussions with the managers of the two Muslim funeral service providers and various representatives of the Muslim communities in a much more informal setting. In 2022, I organized in Le Havre because things was much more formal in France than it was in Southampton. So I organized a kind of roundtable discussion at the university with representatives from Muslim communities, municipal staff, and also professionals from the general funeral sector, les pompes funèbres générales, etc. It was an extremely challenging afternoon, believe me. Many participants confided to me that they found this meeting fascinating and pointed out that it was the first time such a diversity of actors in the funerary sector came together for this type of exchange. So probably I'll be organizing a new roundtable next year. In fact, if I chose to compare those two cities, first because I live in Le Havre, and obviously during the pandemic, this is where I was stuck. I compared also the two cities because they have similar population sizes, as you could see here. Roughly 205,000 people live in Southampton and Le Havre. And also, according to the latest census, 5.6% of Southampton's population identified as Muslims. As you know, in Le Havre, official figures are unavailable, yet I was able to get estimates from Muslim Association, which suggested that the Muslim population is about 12% of the Le Havre's population. Furthermore, the landscape of municipal cemeteries in both cities is quite similar. Southampton has 5 cemeteries, Le Havre has 6. In Southampton, 2 out of 5 have Muslim burial sections. In Le Havre, 2 out of the 6 also have Muslim burial section. It is important to keep in mind one of the cemeteries in Southampton allows burial without a coffin. It's called a shrouded burial. And this because of the nature of the soil. It is not possible in the others. And it's of course important to insist on the fact that in all French cemeteries, whether in Le Havre or anywhere else, burial in a coffin is compulsory. Furthermore, in Southampton, we have Muslim funeral services providers, not in Le Havre. I've interviewed and visited the 2 mortuary facilities. The first one both of them are affiliated to a mosque. The first one is located within the Medina Mosque, which is the largest mosque in Southampton, built by the members of the Pakistani community. The mortuary is accessible directly via the women's entrance, so it was easily accessed, and operates as a Muslim funeral service provider covering the entire Southampton area. And it includes a funeral chapel with refrigeration facilities for up to 6 bodies. So it was really professional. I was impressed, in fact. The 3 founders of Medina Mosque Trust are all of Pakistani origin. They manage the funeral service on a voluntary basis, receive no salary. They asserted all their equipment was acquired through generous donation from the Pakistani community in Southampton and in London. Medina Mosque also owns a hearse to transport bodies. I'm insisting on this because it's going to be important during the crisis. These resources enabled them to independently manage all stages of the funeral process from death to burial without resorting to intermediaries. This ability proved particularly helpful during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was the only Muslim funeral provider which was allowed to continue operating throughout the crisis. This was due, of course, also to its established presence, its convenient location, which complied easily with health and safety regulations, and its ability to operate independently without relying on third parties. The Turkish Muslim Funeral Service, which is Abu Bakr, is affiliated with Abu Bakr al-Sadiq Mosque, which is attended by the Somali and Bangladeshi communities and other Muslim minorities. This service is relatively new, having been established only in 2020, just 2 weeks before the start of the pandemic. It was not authorized to operate during the sanitary crisis because its premises were deemed cramped to ensure the safe movement, which was not the case for Medina Mosque. Both Muslim undertakers insisted heavily on the benevolent aspect of their funerary home. They constantly brought up the religious obligation of tending the dead as one of their primary motivations. Le Havre, there's no Muslim-run funeral service. The Muslim communities rely either on a Muslim funeral service based in Rouen or on general funeral providers, like Les Pompes Funèbres. And furthermore, the Muslim communities are from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Most are of Algerian or Moroccan origins, with other small groups from Senegal or Mali. Over 90% of my interviewees were fluent in both Arabic and French. During the interviews, religious leaders highlighted several shortcomings of these general funeral providers, emphasizing the need for the sector to adapt to their religious specific requirements. One major criticism directed at general funeral services is the lack of respect for the deceased, which can manifest in issues such as long delays before burial and the absence, for example, another example that was often quoted, absence of hot water ritual washing. This was really repeatedly mentioned throughout the 2 years. These complaints about general providers can be interpreted as the inability to establish a specialized association or businesses seen in Southampton, or as a call for general funeral companies to better meet their specific needs. During the pandemic, both sides of the channel witnessed an excessively high rate of ethnic minority mortality. According to the Office for National Statistics, the rate of death involving COVID-19 was highest for the Bangladeshi ethnic group, 5 times greater than the white British group for males and 4.5 times more significant for females, followed by the Pakistani and Black African ethnic groups. Both the Pakistani and the Bangladeshi communities are primarily Muslim. Again, although we don't have official statistics for France, many scholars have documented and analyzed the same patterns in France regarding ethnic minority excess rates. They bypassed direct questions on ethnic background by resorting to questions on place of birth or parents' place of birth. The increase in death is most significant for people born in Africa, plus 54% people born in the Maghreb countries, and plus 114% those born in another African country. So, since we're talking still about figures and statistics, it is important to note that neither France nor Britain maintain national register concerning the burial locations of Muslim population, making it impossible to distinguish between local burial and repatriation. However, as local studies show, national trends have shifted towards local burial rather than repatriation over the past 25 years. This trend is much more pronounced in the UK than in France. To assess the impact of the pandemic on burial sites, I turned to the local level. I chose to compare the occupancy rates of Muslim burial sections in Le Havre and Southampton using data from cemetery authorities covering the period from 2018 to the end of 2022. You can see those figures collected on the table, on the slide, sorry. And it is obvious that it shows that there's a significant increase in 2020, between 2020 and 2021 compared to the average of the preceding years. But also, it is also obvious that after the end of the pandemic and the opening of borders, the rates are still higher than in the pre-COVID period. And this despite the lifting of travel restriction, etc., etc. So the numbers in 2022 did not revert to pre-COVID levels. The pandemic has undoubtedly impacted burial choices among Muslim population in both cities. It is too early to assess the long-term effect, even though we have like 3 years of hindsight. The trends towards local burial continues. This increase in local burial raises practical questions such as expanding cemetery spaces, extra funding, extra allocation, and staff for the funerary sector in cities. It also raises several political questions, particularly relating to ethnic and religious minority visibility in urban landscape. Question their legitimacy in a national narrative and illustrate reluctance to include them in the predefined national groups among the living, but also among the dead. So while the health crisis exposed territorial inequalities, this was everywhere on the news in terms of healthcare and social infrastructure and sanitary infrastructure, it also highlighted disparities in the availability of religious burial sections for Muslim minorities in cemeteries. With the border closed, local dynamic replaced the usual international practices. Official and unofficial actors played a role in shaping death management policies during this period, responding to the challenges posed by the pandemic. An urgent need arose from Muslim communities to find new local contacts, such as funeral directors or cemetery managers, leading new local dialogues around the funerary sectors. In both Southampton and Le Havre, during and after the pandemic, the Muslim associations were in charge of carrying out the religious rituals under COVID-19 restriction, but also in charge of requests for burial spaces within the Muslim sections of cemeteries. The national policies regarding the management of religious plurality significantly influenced the nature of the conversation held in those two cities. In Southampton, discussions focused on practical approaches, centering around how to implement various strategies. In contrast, dialogue in Le Havre took a different direction, concentrating on the legitimacy of the Muslim demands, reflecting a more fundamental inquiry into the rights and recognition of diverse religious beliefs. This contrast really shows how the national context influenced the nature of the discussions, even during a severe pandemic crisis. So in Southampton, the fieldwork finding can be summarized as follows. Managing Muslim burials during the pandemic was experienced as a series of practical and technical adjustments without the involvement of elected officials or district representatives. These discussions were informal. First, it was a matter of establishing authorized funeral operators, and we've seen together that Medina Mosque was authorized to operate during the pandemic, and later setting up WhatsApp group discussions to simplify communication between the cemetery's technical staff and the funeral operator, Medina Mosque. Both the chief of staff at the cemetery and the Muslim funeral operator have played pivotal roles in managing the crisis. The two men showed deep respect for one another's responsibilities and tasks. The chief of staff, a middle-aged white man in his 40s with no ethnic background. He was raised in Southampton, a multicultural environment, as he described it. He repeatedly said during the interview, "We are all brothers," meaning Christian and Muslims. And he also added further in the interview, "We all live in different ways and mourn in different ways." And he added, "Who am I to tell the others how to grieve?" Similarly, the Muslim funeral operator is in his 40s, yet of Pakistani descent. He too highlighted the multicultural way of life in London and to a lesser extent in Southampton, where he was born. It was obvious that he preferred London for its much more pronounced multicultural way of life, but he lived in Southampton. He pursued a law degree in London and worked as a lawyer at one of the Southampton's law firms. He was very eager to show the funerary home facilities he runs with two other friends of Pakistani descent. He specified he had strong religious faith and that he and his two other friends acted on a benevolent basis during their free time as funeral directors, because it was their duty as Muslim to care for the dead. So the interactions between the two men have set the tone for all the other participants in the Muslim burial chain, including the religious leaders and the actors involved in the funeral sector. During the pandemic, most discussions between Medina Mosque and the chief cemetery technician took place via WhatsApp. When asked about the need to coordinate burial requests, the burial ground manager said, "We did not have any meetings. We didn't need them. Thanks to the team and the nature of the work, things have never run so smoothly." When asked about how the pandemic affected his work, he noted that nothing changed. "We already had strong relationship with the Muslim communities. We were working together before. We just applied the rules more strictly. We hardly changed anything. We just anticipated the rise in burial numbers by digging the graves in advance, so as not to delay the burial, which needs to happen quickly, pandemic or not." Compared to the Muslim communities in Southampton, the Muslim communities in Le Havre maintained much more formal relationship with the local authorities during the pandemic. There are tangible factors to explain this, the nature of these relations. There are tangible factors along with more abstract elements that explain this difference in community dynamics. First, the absence of a dedicated Muslim funerary home made the connection between Muslim associations and cemetery administrators less direct than in Southampton. The generalist undertakers, like Pompe Funèbre Générale or other traditional mainstream national operators, are the ones in direct link with the cemetery administration, acting thus as intermediaries between Muslim communities and the cemetery. Second, the Muslim Association spokesperson I've interviewed were from different social, cultural, and age group. Only 2 out of 7 of my interviewees were born in France, for example. The 5 others were either born in Morocco or Algeria. They had few pre-established common ground to connect with the funerary sector on such short notice, and in such an intensive way inflicted by the pandemic. Their traditional professional partners were no longer operating due to the closing of the border, which disrupted their classic work routine. In the early weeks of the pandemic, the main issue for the Muslim associations in Le Havre was to expand the Muslim section of the Bléville cemetery, which was almost full. They had already made this request to the city council before the start of the pandemic, but received no clear answer. Obviously, local authorities were procrastinating. Yet, In the early days of the pandemic, it became urgent to take a decision and to clarify the political choices related to the Muslim burial grounds in Le Havre. The fieldwork clearly shows that managing religious sections within cemeteries involved significant political considerations, as evidenced by meeting with elected officials rather than department heads or employees. This signaled that creating a new religious section went beyond operational concerns and touched on political and symbolic matters. They noted the Muslim association leaders knew the elected officials and deputies, but never met the, the staff or the head staff in the cemeteries. Their relation was only with politicians. In 2021, they felt, and I quote, they needed to have a more comprehensive discussion. The head of a Muslim religious association explained, we attended several meetings with the city council to discuss both legal issues and our needs, then to find a compromise. This compromise was directly related to expanding the capacity of the Bléville Cemetery, where I repeat, there was a pre-existing Muslim sector. In fact, you can see here on the map the different sections in the cemetery of Bléville, which already had 6 separate sections that you can see in red on the map. Rather than expanding Bléville Cemetery as requested by the Muslim associations during the pandemic, local authorities decided to open a new Muslim section in a third cemetery, le Cimetière Nord, North Cemetery, which had previously not included any Muslim. While this decision of opening, you have here le Cimetière Nord on the map, and while this decision of creating a new Muslim section in a new cemetery addressed the immediate need for additional burial plots for the city's Muslim population, it also strained relationship between Muslim religious representatives and local authorities. Because technically, a 7th section could have been added within the Bléville cemetery. This was also what the Muslim Association had been requesting for years, having symbolically embraced the site. In fact, Bléville Cemetery was often referred to as le cimetière musulman du Havre or Le Havre Muslim Cemetery. However, this very symbolic attachment to this cemetery became a source of tension between the Muslim Association and the city during the pandemic. The COVID-19 crisis revealed the search for a symbolic place for Muslims in the city's cemetery. And it was one of my findings, in fact, after this research, that the Muslim associations in Le Havre were looking for a symbolic place in the cemetery. In Southampton, if the burial rate observed in 2022 continues, the city's Muslim slots are expected to reach full capacity by 2026. Furthermore, the cemetery where shrouded burials are allowed is projected to be full by 2025, early 2026, with no possibility of expansion as the cemetery is bordered by a motorway on one side and a big residential area on the other. So the impending saturation of burial spaces does not seem to alarm either the leaders of Muslim associations or public authority. Even when asked directly, are you going to find a solution? Are you afraid that no solution might be found to have any other alternative after 2026? Nobody seemed to be, at least compared to what was happening in Le Havre, there was two different attitudes, totally different attitude. And I think that the stability of religious figures recognized as legitimate partners in managing cultural and religious plurality has enabled privileged relationship to be established between the uh, different partners or operators. True that the multicultural framework, which remains the model for managing diversity in the United Kingdom, at least concerning the funerary sector, involves public recognition of minority identities and cultures, and induces less tensions concerning funeral management compared to what I have observed in France. Le Havre, the pandemic clarified the city's policy on managing Muslim sections within municipal cemeteries. It was decided not to open new sections in Blainville Cemetery, but to create several others in other cemeteries in the city that previously did not have. Thus, in 2021, the city opened a new section for a Muslim burial area in the Northern Cemetery, with another section planned for 2027 in the same cemetery. Meanwhile, a Muslim section is set to open, and now it's open in Rouelle Cemetery in 2025. So this year, 4 of the city's 6 cemeteries will have Muslim sections, compared to 2 before the pandemic. They have anticipated an average burial rate around 60 per year, and this should meet demand until 2028. So unlike the situation in Southampton and in Britain in general, in the name of secularism, au nom de la laïcité, French political discourse leaves little room for religion of any kind, but provides equal burial rights for all the citizens. By disseminating Muslim sections across nearly all the cemeteries in Le Havre, the city ensures the right to burial based on each person's religious belief. Of course, I remind you that religion is considered as a fundamental freedom in concerning burial rights. So by disseminating Muslim sections around nearly all the cemeteries in Le Havre, it also tries to, I'm not going to say invisibilize the Muslims. This dispersal appears to obscure the actual number of Muslim graves, rendering them less prominent in the public eye. This diminishes their visible recognition, also fosters an environment where their cultural and religious significance is overlooked or marginalized. This goes beyond burial sites and symbolically legitimizes Muslim faith practices in a climate where Islam in France has become an obsessive and passionate issue. I'm quoting Vieux. Requests made by Muslim representatives challenge normative principle and as such are seen unacceptable. Nevertheless, public authorities maintain a form of regulation by granting requests made by religious authorities while keeping them within their interpretation of public and secular framework. In France, or at least in Le Havre, Muslims assert their right to participate fully in collective life as Muslim citizens. They seek, and I think that the problem is that they seek a symbolic recognition that the secular republic cannot offer them. And I think this is where the difficulty is in terms of specific places, visible specific places in cemeteries. So My fieldwork conclusions. In fact, the fieldwork and the analysis during those 2 years led me to two unexpected conclusions. The first is that local authorities in Le Havre and Southampton have responded to the Muslim community's demand regarding the management of burials during the COVID-19 pandemic. Both cities have tried to ensure equal treatment of Muslims deceased. Le Havre has opted for a centralized planning approach for opening Muslim burial sections, guaranteeing spaces well beyond the municipality of Southampton has accomplished. When you compare what the local authorities in Le Havre have accomplished and what Southampton have accomplished, Le Havre is doing way better. At the same time, the fieldwork revealed a different perception of reality among the Muslim communities in Southampton and Le Havre. There is a marked disparity between the perception of reality held by Muslim communities and the actual circumstances in both cities. Indeed, the secular framework is perceived and invoked in Le Havre as an impediment implementing specific measures. Muslim communities in Le Havre, the pandemic has catalyzed transition from the margin to the center of municipal cemeteries and municipal funeral practices. Consequently, Muslim burial sections will soon be implemented in 4 of the city's 6 cemeteries. In Southampton, discussions are more serene, true, focusing primarily on funerals, technical or practical aspects, while totally overlooking the political dimension of the interactions between minority and majority. Uncertainties remain the number of Muslim burial sections available in the city beyond 2026.
Thank
The
you.
general conclusion in both Le Havre and Southampton, local policies reflect the core political principles of, if I can call them principles, of each country. However, in times of crisis, the application has been adjusted to protect fundamental rights. This dynamic highlights a certain opposition between technical and political aspects. In France, there is a greater emphasis on the fundamental political stakes, recognition and legitimization, of recognizing and legitimizing the minority religious demands expressed by Muslim communities. In the British context, Muslim funeral requests do not seek a horizon of legitimization, rather fall within the technical domain concerning what can or cannot be done within a national framework. In this framework, religious minorities do not need to establish their legitimacy as partners in dialogue. These observations regarding the funerary sector can also extend to how the expression of the Muslim faith is negotiated within society. The foundational principles of each country's political philosophy greatly influence how minority rights are perceived, either legitimized or delegitimized. Thank you for your attention. That 45 minutes, I was right on time.
Right on.
Congratulations, Nada. Thanks so much. That was great. It was a great conclusion too. I really enjoyed this. I'm sure Vincent enjoyed it too.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely great.
Yeah, shall we, before, I'm sure Vincent is, and certainly I have a lot of questions, but before we start talking, can we open the floor to other participants, perhaps?
Of course.
Yes.
Very
Anyone?
welcome to ask questions.
Well, if I can, is it okay, Vincent, if I just start off the discussion? Because
Of course, yes.
thanks, because Nada, I really enjoyed. I've been aware of your work on multiculturalism and death, as I think you call it, or you've been calling it at least for quite a while. I've always found it very stimulating, very, very original, and important angle into everything we do together with Vincent Midib in the exploration of diversity, politics, and society in Britain, and in the British Isles more generally. But I wasn't aware of this new wave of research you've done on COVID, which if I may call it new, since it's already 4 or 5 years.
It's old history now.
Yeah, but this is the first time I see you presenting it. So I thought it was really exciting because, so stop me if I'm wrong, but the way I interpret I understand your conclusion is that COVID served as a crisis that actually helped to prod maybe not the whole of France, I'm not sure, but at least the municipality of Le Havre towards what I feel, it seems to me, is de facto a more multiculturalist approach to Les Carrés Musulmans, because as you explained, they the political stakes were higher in France, which is very interesting to see that the COVID crisis just nudges politically France in a path that wasn't its own before that. And they decided to systematically, centrally, at the level of the municipality of Le Havre, to plan for more carrés musulmans, so places for Muslims to be buried. Whereas Wolverhampton, well, it doesn't mean they became less multiculturalist or less interested in recognizing diversity in cemeteries. It's just that they didn't need to. So the COVID crisis perhaps had less impact on Wolverhampton, if I understood correctly. Yeah.
Yeah, this is exactly the case. What the effect of the pandemic in Le Havre was extremely important concerning the placing of the dead, the Muslim dead, because there have been talk going on like for 5 years before the pandemic with the Muslim communities and the local authorities about the need to expand the Blainville cemetery. And what is interesting is that the Muslim community wanted to keep its presence in only one single cemetery, whereas the solution was provided, and I find it very intelligent and also very in line with the Republican, I would say, way of dealing with pluralism, is that everybody was granted a place in the cemetery, and even now 2 new cemeteries have Muslim carrés musulmans, have Muslim burial sections. But this made the Muslim community unhappy, and this, as I just said, this strained even more the relation. But so I asked them, what do you need? You were asking for more burial places, and now you have them. But they wanted to have this symbolic presence, symbolic recognition. And as I just said, it is impossible for the Republic as it is to offer them this symbolic recognition. But they're looking for a symbolic place. And I think that there is an ongoing, I would say, dialogue between the place of Muslims in France and also their place in the cemetery. At least this is what I understood from the different interviews. And believe me, I spent lots of time in individual interviews, group interviews, talking about their specific need and trying to come up to understand what was missing in the political response of local authorities. And what was also surprising is that in Southampton, everybody was happy. Really, at least when I was there, I felt as if I was wasting my time, in fact, because there was nothing to talk about. Everybody was happy. Nobody had anything to mention, no incident, nothing.
Yeah.
Everything went smoothly. But when you look at the figures, they're going to run out of burial places very soon, in less than 1 year. And it wasn't seen as a problem.
So maybe I was a bit over enthusiastic about France, perhaps suddenly, or Le Havre becoming more multicultural just because of COVID. I mean,
it was becoming multicultural, Romain. Romain,
Sorry?
it is multicultural in the sense that now in every cemetery, you have a Muslim spot.
Right.
In this sense, it is becoming multicultural, but it is not in the sense that one cemetery cannot represent, I would say, Muslim death in Le Havre. So Muslim death is disseminated, dispatched in every cemetery in the city, and not, I would say, located in one single specific area. And the fact that it was called Le Cimetière Musulman, clearly, I felt it when I was talking with the officials, this was clearly a problem for them that needed to be dealt with.
Interesting, thanks. Vincent?
Yes, I have a lot of questions and remarks. It was fascinating as usual. And although I've been familiar with your research for a number of years, I still find it fascinating. And the new angle, stemming from the impact of the pandemic is certainly a very interesting addition to your research. So the first thing I would like to say, maybe for the British people among us, is that Muslims in France are not treated differently from other religious groups. That is, Nada's paper is on the question of Muslim sections in cemeteries, but the same applies to other religious minorities who are not entitled to have separate cemeteries. So it's not just something, because we've seen from the UK sometimes this may be interpreted as Muslims being taken as a target. But it's just the Republican approach. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Then, yes, I have two questions. One that is practical and one that is more political. You mentioned the increase in recent years in local burial, right, as against
repatriation.
Repatriation. So how does it compare financially? Because do people actually opt for local burial in France because it's cheaper, or because we may assume also there is a greater form of attachment to the country where the parents, their children were born and raised, where they spent decades? So I would like to have your opinion about that.
The financial aspect is clearly not a relevant one, because the costs of repatriation and local burial amounts, roughly speaking, to around 3,000 and 4,000 euros. It is the case in France, and in Britain, it is even more expensive to bury locally than to repatriate. The thing is that we are seeing troisième génération, I don't know how to put it in English, children in France now who has never set a foot in Algeria or Morocco, and who have local attachment. And I've done some interviews, but not that many, with people who decide to be buried here, or who has already chosen to be repatriated. And one element is that they want their kids and their grandkids to be able to visit them. And that's why they opt for local burial rather than repatriation. And others, really, I just had an interview with a very old lady, and who really absolutely wanted to be buried in France, but in Muslim burial sections. She did not want to be buried with the others, with non-Muslims. And when I asked her why is it so important for you? And she was really genuinely believed that it is very important for her to be buried among Muslims, because on Judgment Day, she doesn't want to wake up alone. So this element of this religious element of this faith, the importance of faith, is obvious in this choice also of the place of burial. They want to be buried among Muslims in order to be surrounded by other believers on Judgment Day. They don't want to wake up alone. So it sounds a bit naive or absurd, but this is they believed in it, and this is what faith is about.
Okay, yeah. So we can say that there's been a sort of extension of Muhammad Anwar's myth of return even to dead people. I mean, the return even of dead people is now a myth because it's no longer a reality.
Exactly. It's no longer a myth that is as vivid as it was during the first and second generations. And this is something that was not planned for. When we talk about immigration, we talk about the problems concerning education, we talk problems concerning health, mental health, but nobody really talked until very recently about the problem of dead immigrants. What do we do with them? So there's also a need to have a place or a program, a specific policy for them. And the pandemic, in that sense, was really important because it forced local authorities to deal with this problem that everybody wanted to put aside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we
It's
have
really
a question. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
There was just a question. I'm leaving one of my questions for later. We have a question from Lucy Painter in the chat. So this is Lucy's question. Thank you so much for such fascinating talk. You mentioned that you may hold more roundtable discussions in the future with Muslim religious leaders in Le Havre. Do you plan on continuing conversations with religious leaders and cemetery managers in Southampton also, especially given the projected saturation of space in coming years?
Well, thank you for this question. I can first tell you that I did not sleep the night before I organized this roundtable because I was aware that we have around the table people that have never really had discussion, or at least not a peaceful discussion. But I'm going to try. Let me just go through the different. Oops, voilà. Voilà. Can you see? Is it big enough or not?
Yeah, I think so. You may want to put it on the full screen mode. If you...
Yeah, I'm putting it on the screen mode. Poof. Voilà.
Good.
In fact, what was interesting in this meeting is that none of the deputies or city councillors that I invited accepted the invitation. But I had only one member from local the local authorities who's in charge of cemeteries and green places, because this is it, c'est les espaces verts et les cimetières. And what I was surprised, the presence of the general director of Les Pompes Funèbres de France. He came personally, in fact, and another very big important j'arrive pas à lire, I can't read it, it's too small to me, in fact. I don't know how you manage, but I'm sure that you're younger than me. What's his name? I forget. Anyway, so it is another big firm, Anubis, yes, who is in fact in charge, who has nearly 70% of the market of repatriation. And then I was so surprised. I invited them, and I was very surprised to see them come to Le Havre from Paris to participate in this. And then later on, nice. While discussing with them, it was a big market that they don't want to miss. Because Muslim communities in France are trying to create and to turn to Muslim undertakers, just as it is already the case in Britain since 2022. And they know that there's a shift in tendency, and Muslims are deciding, or there are bigger numbers of Muslims who opt for local burials, and they don't want to miss this new market. So that's why they were here. But what was also very interesting is during these discussions, they were adopting the same discourse that local officials had in terms of laïcité, etc. But the demands, there was about religious specificities in ritual washing, etc. So laïcité has absolutely nothing to do with it. It is religious. It is clearly religious rituals. So you're not going to come and ask a religious group to adopt secular rituals for death. So there was something of a terrible misunderstanding, I would say, between how to formulate the Muslim demands and also how to meet these demands. But it was really interesting, and I was till the end. It was like 4 hours. Nothing was planned. We were just around the table. I had prepared several questions. And yes, I'm sure that I'm going to organize another roundtable in Le Havre, but I'm not sure for Southampton because I still have the WhatsApp group and nobody really feels the need of organizing anything because they don't think that there's something to something that should be debated. And another element which is important is that the funerary legislation in Britain allows for the creation of private cemeteries. And so if there is a real, I would say, if they come to a clear and horrible shortage in terms of burial plots, it is possible to create, and the legislation is very easy on that subject. It is very easy to create a private cemetery for Muslim, just like the one in London with the Garden of Peace, which is one of the biggest Muslim cemeteries in Europe, which has been extended twice since it was created in 2006. So I think they already have a solution in the private sector.
That's really interesting. The contrast between the role of the private sector in the two countries, but also Anubis in France. I was wondering. I don't want to rush to mischaracterize or characterize excessively, exceedingly to simplify exceedingly your very nuanced observations. But do you think there's something at play around the relations between Anubis and the authorities, which would be something akin to a kind of de facto, unsaid, implicit multiculturalist practice on the part of the French authorities that they'll accept to deal with companies like or organizations like Anubis, and the end result something that we've been seeing from the start, I think, is that Muslims in France managed to get done all of their ritual burials in exactly the same way. Well, maybe not exactly the same way, but in more or less without impediment as they would in the UK or maybe even Muslim countries. And the French authorities get to say that they are laïque, and as you were saying, it's on two different levels, in fact. So there's a kind of implicit, kind of subtle understanding between the Muslim actors and the French state to let the Muslims be Muslims, because that's a religious imperative, is something that's very hard to you can't ask people to forget about, and the state manages to continue, or the municipality of Le Havre manages to continue on putting up a sort of a Republican assimilationist universalist facade.
It is exactly this. So you have the two level, like kind of acceptance that the Muslims, let them be Muslims, but we're going to continue offering at least this general frame and this general discourse. Clearly, evidently, it's this. And that's why the interviews I had with the politicians, the members, the elected members of the city town hall in charge of the cemetery, it was a very difficult discussion because there's absolutely no quote in my paper on these specific interviews, because it was just empty words. And if I wanted to illustrate what I was saying, I would have to quote the whole interview, because the whole interview is interesting because there's a clear absence of any decision. It is just that it reminded me of an introduction of a dissertation, for example, of a bad dissertation. I had this impression of a weak student preparing an introduction for a dissertation. So this was the whole interview, like 3 interviews. They went exactly like this.
I understand. Thanks. Yeah, that makes sense. I've done interviews myself, which were a bit like that. I remember. Yeah. Vincent?
Yes, I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize actually your speech, but no, it's so interesting. I'm really eager to read your book, Nada. So, so there we go.
Yeah, this part will be in the book, the management of the pandemic.
Really impatient to read that. I have a question. I said it's a political question. And do you think that the political orientation of municipalities plays a role? Because we know that Le Havre is a right of center municipality. So we might have maybe expected it to be less open to these issues than, more progressive municipalities. And we may think about the impact of the, the victory of the national rally in certain municipalities. I don't know, in Perpignan or in places like that, or in Béziers. How do they deal with these issues? Do they deal as openly with these issues as, or do they try to prevent any evolution locally? Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, again, it's every local authority has its specificity, and there's absolutely no national vision, either in France or in Britain, on the number of Muslim plots in cemeteries. So, but there are many locals now. I came across many other colleagues working on Lyon, for example, or other parts, or Marseille, and in London and other parts in other parts of Britain. And what it seems to be clear, and I've observed this myself, is that the presence of in the among the members of the city town hall, people from ethnic minority background have always initiated, at least for Le Havre and for Southampton, they initiated this first movement for specific burial places. It is also the case in Lyon. In Marseille, it's another story because it's a historical presence. But the fact, the political affiliation, I think, do not play a very important role in creating specific religious spots or plots in the cemetery. Because in Normandy, during the pandemic too, another local authority, because they have started to refuse derogations. You know that you should be buried in the place where you vote or where you live. And Muslims all around Normandy died during the pandemic and wanted to be buried in the Muslim carré in Le Havre, but derogations were refused because you need to ask for a derogatory status to be buried here. So it was refused during the pandemic because they already had a lot to deal with, but they sent from Le Havre to other local authorities people to help them set their own Muslim sections, and the 3 local authorities were run by center-right mayors and majorities. So if I look at Le Havre during the pandemic, what I can tell you is that it is mostly in cities where right or center-right mayors have the majority, which decided to create those areas.
That's fascinating. It's great results, Nada. Thanks, because I think it's no surprise that center-right local governments would not be opposed, at the very least, to this kind of logic, this kind of policy, because of the tradition of a Catholicism in center-right politics in France.
We have a question from Patricia, actually. So you can.
Thank you. Hello. Just a quick question. You mentioned the rules in France about voting in the area or living in the area. I was wondering, in Le Havre, was it a question that some representatives from the Muslim community preferred Bléville because there were other sections, but was there local demand in other areas? Is there a connection between where Muslims live and the Muslim sections in the cemeteries? And was it the case that you had Muslim communities in other parts of Le Havre who maybe were happy with the fact that they had a local Muslim section?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Patricia, for your question. In fact, it is, you normally you are buried in the cemetery of your neighborhood. But concerning Bléville, they had their own habits. This is what he told me. We already know the place. We know where to stand for the prayer, for the prayers before the burial, etc. And we know the people who live there. And Bléville, true, Bléville is in an area where there is a majority living population from ethnic background. So yes, but the Cimetière Nord, for example, is one of the biggest cemeteries in Le Havre. And I was surprised not to see a Muslim plot. You had the impression where you go, where you attend a funeral, friends, etc., that if this friend is not from an ethnic background, you go to Cimetière Nord. And if this friend is from Muslim origin, you know that you're going to end up in Bléville. So by creating in the Cimetière Nord a Muslim plot, I think that they brought the Muslim death from the margins to the heart of the funerary landscape. And in this sense, it is a way of integrating, or it is a way of putting the funerary Muslim landscape at the heart of the general national landscape. And it is in this sense that it sounds multicultural, really, as the theory of multiculturalism, of public spaces being a reflection of the diversity of the society.
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah. Thanks to Patricia for the question and Nada for the answer. That was fascinating. That was great.
I just want to add another element, that in Britain, you have absolutely no obligation whatsoever concerning the burial place. So you could live in Southampton and decide to go and be buried in London, or decide to go to be buried in a natural burial ground. So you are free to choose where to be buried.
Okay. Do we have more questions, anybody? No? Anyone?
I'll have more questions, but on other occasions. It's lunchtime in France, and it's even more lunchtime in Lebanon, I think.
Yeah, it's even more lunchtime in Lebanon. And did you see, we had absolutely no electricity cuts, etc. Everything went so smoothly.
Yes.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
I wasn't expecting this.
I mean, yeah, we could have said that you were in Normandy, and everybody would have believed it, you know.
Well, except for the sunlight.
Except for the sunlight, yeah, clearly.
So maybe it's
we don't want to keep you from enjoying your mezze and all these delicious, Lebanese dishes, I imagine, that are simmering somewhere.
So maybe it's time to announce the next session. So the next session will be a joint seminar with the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship from the University of Bristol. And it will take place on the 30th of April at 5 local time. So it's 4 UK time, but 5 French time. And the speaker will be Marie Gaudin from Oxford University and Leicester University. And the title of the presentation will be Digitizing Identity, Navigating the Digital Immigration System and Migrant Experiences. Right. So many thanks again for attending, and many thanks especially Nada for the fascinating paper. And we're all very eager to read your forthcoming monograph. Thanks again.
Thanks everyone. Not many people, but the best.
Yes, very good quality.
Thank you, Fida, for attending.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating.
Thank you. Bye everyone.